But what's happening now amongst the young people, and I talk to schools, I've taught for 25 years, environmentalism is changing. It's become a religion. It's taken a whole religious component to it. And of course, that makes it even more difficult to challenge because the climate change is just a subset of environmentalism, right? It's big in itself, but it's really just a subset of the whole idea of environmentalism. Okay, now, Thomas Malthus, and by the way, these essays on population, Darwin took a copy of that on the Beagle with him. He thought Malthus was absolutely right. And there's some interesting undercurrents in here because Darwin had a cousin by the name of Galton, who's the guy that created the term eugenics. So you had all of those things about population and control of population, all those ideas kicking around at the same time. Malthus said the population would outgrow the food supply. Of course, that was absolutely wrong. And if you go and look at what Malthus did, the examples he said, oh, look at America, look at the population growing there and the food supply. Of course, he ignored the fact that there was huge migration into the United States at the time. So it's just terrible, terrible science. So if we list, just keep clicking through, population would outgrow food supply. And then there was a group called the Club of Rome that formed in 1968. And they decided that Malthus was right, but they extended it, so the population would outgrow all resources because of industrial development. That became the central theme of what we're dealing with today, that there are too many people in the planet, and each person is using too many resources, particularly the industrialized nations. So they became the focus. Because one of the questions that I try to get the public to ask themselves is, why the focus on CO2? It's all those other gases. Why CO2 become the focus? And it's one of those sort of obvious questions that's so obvious you don't think to ask it. Well, of course, we then got the population issue is really the underlying issue here. And Tony brought in Paul Ehrlich's. I can't believe he's still got a job. This is absolutely amazing. Yeah. There's hope for me yet. But Ehrlich was publishing books with this guy, John Holdren. And the book they published together was Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment. Okay, John Holdren is today Obama's science czar. Okay, he's the guy that created the term polar vortex, which is we knew about cold air flowing out of the Arctic or Antarctic. There's nothing new. He just gave it a new term. And he created the term, so he went from global warming to climate change to climate disruption. Because he started to realize that people were saying, well, climate changes all the time. Oh, I thought we were talking about climate disruption. Oh, well, if it's a disruption, it's interfering with natural processes. Ergo, it must be something humans are doing. That's the thinking that's going on here. And here's a quote from that book. And it underlines how these people operate. John Holdren wrote, indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. Let me dissect that for you for a minute. It has been concluded. Who concluded that? Who's the it? And the answer is they did. They concluded it's a problem, right? So this is setting up the straw man. And then it says that even including laws could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe. Who decides that? They do. So they set up the problem and they determine the parameters for when they invoke the necessary activities to stop the endangering of society. And I'll show you that idea comes up again in the climate issue in just a minute. Okay, of course, out of that came the first very simplistic computer model, use of computer model in resources, the limits to growth. It was grossly simple linear trends. And by the way, this is the book where peak oil became a big issue. That here's the amount of resource, we're using it at this rate, therefore we're going to run out at this point, or we'll reach the peak of its use at this point. So limits to growth, as I said, was the preamble really to the computer models of the IPCC. The Club of Rome, 1994, the president of it, Alexander King, the first global revolution. And of course, the use of the word revolution is very important. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. What they needed was something that was threatening the whole world. Because what they knew was that they couldn't get all the nation states to go along. You can see that with Kyoto, and you can see it with the Paris Accord, the Green Climate Fund, and so on. So they wanted something, and global warming, of course, fit the bill very nicely. Next slide. And here's the guy. I'm ashamed to say he's Canadian. He's not with us anymore. This is Maurice Strong. And I want everybody in the world to get to know this guy and know of him. I talked to people that went to school with him, that grew up with him in Canada, worked for him, worked against him, and so on. He was the most manipulative person, incredibly manipulative, but a superb organizer, particularly of bureaucracies. And of course that, and I'll build on this theme a little bit later, but Mary McCarthy, American social commentator, said, bureaucracy, the rule of no one, the modern form of despotism. And of course, it's through the bureaucracies that these things are being achieved. So Maurice Strong, oh sorry, back to that one. In a book called The Cloak of Green, written by Elaine Dewar, in a superb piece of journalism, she started out a book. She wanted to praise all the Canadian environmentalists, David Suzuki, Elizabeth May. The more research she did, the more she found these people were more corrupt than the corporations they were attacking. And so she then wrote a book condemning these people. And sorry, back to the previous one. This is the key phrase here. Isn't the only hope for the planet the industrialized nation collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? And I want you to ask yourself, how would you do that? It's all very well to have these ideas, but to actually implement them, it's very, very difficult challenge. And of course, the answer is, if you think about the industrialized nation, which of course is using the resources at a far greater rate than anybody else and therefore has to be shut down, think about the industrialized nation as the engine in a car. You can stop the engine of the car by squeezing the fuel line. Well, if you did that with a nation, people would scream right away. Just look at what happens when there's fuel shortages somewhere. Right? But you can also stop an engine by plugging the exhaust. That will stop the engine too. So if you can show that the byproduct of the burning of the fossil fuels is causing runaway global warming, then you've got a way of stopping the industrialized nation. So that's why CO2 became the gas of concern and focus. Okay, well then, once you've got that, what do? Next one. And by the way, Dewar reached this conclusion in her book. Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis in the global governance agenda. There it is, right there. Okay, next one. And here's how he set it up. He set up the United Nations Environment Program, the Rio Declaration 1992. And I'm going to come back to that year 1992 a little bit later on, because he also took over control of all of the energy production in the province of Ontario in that same year. Ontario, he took it from being one of the most powerful, energy-supported provinces in Canada. It is now in desperation. The citizens of Ontario are going to be paying for 40 years for what he did in that province. That's the same year he set up the Rio Declaration. He set up the political side of it, Agenda 21, of course, the Conference of the Parties. That's the political body that makes the decisions. On the scientific side, of course, he used the World Meteorological Organization to set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Why? Because if he could control the national weather bureaus, CSIRO, BOM, or NOAA, then he had direct access to the politicians. Because the politicians are not going to challenge their own scientists. Strong did this deliberately. I've talked to people that talked with him and knew all about it. And so, as I said, this link here is very, very important. Okay. And here's the most important thing, and I just preamble to this. I used to think government inquiries were great ideas, fabulous. Hey, yeah, finally get the politics out of the damn issue. Until I got appointed to my first commission of inquiry. And it was over a lake in Canada, and great conflict over it. And the minister said, would you serve on the commission? Yeah, fine. When we got the terms of reference, they were so written that there was only one conclusion we could reach. It's through the terms of reference that the politicians and the bureaucrats direct. This is what Strong did here, because this is the definition of climate change given to the IPCC. A change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity. In other words, don't go looking at that natural stuff. We don't want any of those. Get that sun out of here. We don't want to talk about the sun. We only want to look at human causes of climate change. And the public, most of the public think that they're still looking at total climate change. That's the deception. And of course, the IPCC makes sure that they don't get to know that. Okay, I wanted to show you this graph because it's actually from Stephen Schneider, who of course is very central to this whole climate scam business. And it's a systems diagram of atmospheric processes, and it shows you how complicated the situation actually is. When you look at all of this, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 pieces that make up the complexity of what creates weather and climate, and they focused on CO2. Okay, so they pick one gas out of the whole thing and so virtually ignore everything else. Next slide. Here's the forcing